So, Christopher is a doctoral student in religion, psychology, and culture, as well as a fellow in the Theology and Practice program at Vanderbilt University. His presentation is titled Recognizing the Ecological Self in Migration and Pastoral Theology. Take it away, Christopher.
Thanks, Jenna. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. There we go. And thanks to all Yale graduate students for just providing this space for us and to share and connect. And thanks, Nathan. I think we have some resonances. So I come to this vast and complex conversation with an interest and concern for the ecological self and pastoral theology, spiritual care, and migration studies. And one way of attending to the pastoral theology's inconsistency to grapple with the ecological aspects in the formation or malformation of selfhood, both human selfhood and selfhood of the rest of the earth, contends, I propose, with the roots of the study of spiritual care and a dependence on social science. And the ecological self, just for brevity's sake, it's a human development construct emerging from deep ecology and various psychospiritual discussions. And we can understand it for today as a sense of experience, of our embodied experience, and since personhood is intertwined with our early interactions as children with the more than human environment, that mind, body, society, and nature are linked in unconscious ways. And as eco-psychoanalyst Joseph Dodds explains, our grounding of existence cannot view the ecological only as an influencing backdrop to our lives, but rather the ecological is inextricable to a selfhood. And this development of self with particular ecological experiences involves emotional elements called resonances that we feel in our bodies, and what eco-feminist theologian Ivan Gabata names as longings, and we heard the rabbi also mention longings earlier. And so my research depends on psychiatrist Salman Akhtar's observations on how our consciousness and resonances of the ecological self becomes more acute in the experience of religious life and migration. And I came to that for two reasons. I approach attending to the ecological self as decades of a clinical field experience as a spiritual care practitioner myself in Ecuador, primarily with migrants and internally displaced persons, as well as with migrating communities in Chicago. And I became increasingly aware of the importance of the ecological self within dislocation. Second, pastoral theology as a field and some related subfields have often avoided major concerted approaches to the ecological self, partially due to the dependence on roots in classical psychoanalysis. And our attention to what we call the living web has come under renewed scrutiny recently, as we have not maintained a sustained conversation in regards to the largest thread in the web, the ecological. And if you haven't guessed by now, one of those problematic roots could be found in Sigmund Freud, who placed maturity and culture in opposition to nature, or at the very least, positive developmental hierarchy, where persons must emerge and separate from the ecological religious processes that would mediate, explore, extend, or blur the very thresholds of human limits, even promoting a reciprocal relationship with ecological otherness that would not be Freud's idea of a positive formation of self or human personhood. Much of Freud's unease depends on his understanding of the oceanic and civilization's discontents. He writes of his friend Romain Rolland's articulation of his religious experience as oceanic, a sense of being unbounded, limitless, a feeling of indissoluble bond, of being one with the external world as a whole. And Freud equates the oceanic with a feeling of being in love, but also finds that religious response and experience of the oceanic can be traced to an unmet infantile need or memory of helplessness and longing for the father's protection and the mother's womb. Essentially, Freud pathologizes a deep connection to the ecological and religious experience. Salman Akhtar, on the other hand, began writing on immigration and exile as he became dissatisfied with his own care experience while studying psychiatry here in the United States. After years of clinical as well as collegial discussion with fellow immigrants, Akhtar surmises that the loss of a familiar ecological environment must be attended to in similar ways to the loss of social roles and relationships. Engaging three of his areas of ecological dislocation today, I'll look at the separation from familiar ecological surround, alteration in human-animal relationship, and encounter with new utensils of living. And I'll elaborate briefly on each with drawing from religious practice and care experiences in Ecuador. Approaching Freud's understanding of the oceanic not as an experience to overcome, Akhtar concludes that these experiences in the environment are a necessary counter to the trauma of dislocation from a person's formative ecological surround. Reflecting on Freud's critique, Akhtar admits to his own feelings and psychosomatic response. He writes, "And I myself have experienced near oceanic waves of happiness upon visiting Mexico and parts of the southeastern United States, whose geophysical texture reminds me of the region in India where I grew up. Such pleasurable moments paradoxically give testimony to what otherwise is lacking. A glass of water appears irresistible only to one who is thirsty. A complex relationship often becomes more apparent through loss. The underlying ecological self is often only conscious through complications in describing a sense of feeling lost in a new environment when dislocated. When we are pushed past the boundaries of the symbiotic orbit of familial ecological surrounds, the otherness of a place has the possibility of creating a sense of alienation. Quote, this state of alienation is dramatically unmasked when one comes across topography, climate, or vegetation that formed a part of one's formative environment," end quote. Venezuelan refugees taken on a trip to the Ecuadorian coast remark on the stark contrast in color and temperature to the Caribbean waters back home, yet recognize the white sands beneath their feet. Instinctually, they place their baby in the sand, remarking to the child with tears in their eyes as he grasps the beach, "This is home." This visceral, emotional reaction, often unexpected, attests to an ecological self. Akhtar again. "I have seen an analyst colleague born and raised in Botswana burst into delirious joy upon seeing bougainvilleas as we were driving from the airport to our hotel in Hawaii." The second aspect Akhtar reviews is the alteration in human-animal relationship. Is the black cat blessing or curse? Is a snake a symbol of power and wisdom or treachery and cunning? One of the case studies I offer is the importance of the consumption of cuy, guinea pig, for parts of Ecuadorian social and religious life, and how that relationship shifts in meaning. The guinea pig is utilized as a sign of celebration and solemnity, eaten at feast days such as Inti Raymi, or St. Peter's and St. Paul's, at parish or school foundation days, and at weddings. The smell, the roasting, the presentation, the taste of the cuy creates bodily responses for people, a sign of an event with spiritual and religious impact. Including here, the eating cuy is not an exoticized encounter, but rather a vignette to how human-animal relations alter throughout the world. What animal is friend and available for comfort, companionship, and protected? Which animals are acceptably raised for consumption? Are animals allowed to be consumed? If so, who is authorized to slaughter and under what conditions? Is the black cat benevolent or bedeviled? Religions often monitor and manage these relationships between humanity and the rest of the ecological realm, embedded into our collective imaginations deeply. Akhtar states, "The linguistic ploys of curses and endearments involving a particular animal suffer the fate of confusion, contradiction, and atrophy when an immigrant is contending with multiple cultures," end quote. Does the squeak of the cuy signal companionship or consumption? An induced visceral reaction and signifier at the sight of a guinea pig, such as hunger pains and saliva production, yet occurring within a culture that would find such consumption prohibitive, such as an Ecuadorian living in New York or Chicago, conveys the tensions within the ecological self. Such, quote, discontinuity taxes the ego, but the pain unknown to the native of the adoptive country goes unnoticed. Alterations also occur due to the constancy of species in any given place. If you've moved, consider for a moment the bird song from your hometown, or what regional animals seem exotic to visitors, but a normal part of your home. Varying species become part of the everyday. Relationship between certain species, expectation to certain sounds, such as a particular bird song, often become subconscious signals of safety or companionship that undergird our emotional life. Throughout history, altered relationships between humans and animals have brought about biophysical and biopsychical changes as we move to new places and new ecological surrounds. Different environments necessitate a variety of proper utensils for dealing with the realities of such places. Again, the limits and lines between culture and nature blur. Excuse me. Communities in the desert create loose fitting yet all covering attire to battle sun and heat, about times prescribing religious significance to the where. Social construction, religious revelation, or ecological response reinforce the religious or cultural significance of many utensils in particular places. When forced immediately to use new tools and necessary utensils, oftentimes items that take years of socialization to master, immigrants can feel inadequate, shamed, and alienated. Broadly speaking, confronting limitations influences how objects impact anxiety or ease. Akhtar notes that, quote, familiar objects help us feel safe. They are containers of our memory and anchors of our identity. We depend upon them to conduct our daily lives in their usual way, end quote. An immigrant after 30 years in the United States returns to Ecuador, handling a machete for the first time in 3 decades. The familiarity, the movement, the sense of belonging instantly return the man to a tool and to the environment that produced the tool. From clothing to architecture, utensils of living refer to these daily needs and daily orientations. To close, I offer this admixture of spiritual, religious, and ecological, all within the mundane, to draw attention to the blurring of boundaries between self, culture, and nature, and embodied formation to carry our conference theme of hope. First, hopeful that my own subfield is recognizing with roots that pathologize our responses, such as eco-anxiety, that still pit human against the environment, and that we can begin to be less defensive of our relationship with the ecological and draw more on spiritual care practices that define the self in our creatureliness or as part of the whole. Second, our experiences of resonance to our particular topography, our anxiety, or the sense of being out of sorts because of ecological degradation for Gabara reveal our longings for something different. Longings are an expression of hope, of the possibility of increasing our ecological sensibilities. Akhtar articulates how at a deep level, migrating people are responding, often neuropsychologically and somatically, to a dislocation of an ecological self. The oceanic experience allows for restorative reformation, but a beneficial psychospiritual response resists rushing to a restorative practice. As Stephen Frosch advises, feeling out of sorts could be the beginning of something new, and perhaps we should not be in too much of a hurry to put ourselves back in order again. Experiences of the oceanic should be engaged not to overcome a dis-ease with ourselves, but are a necessary counter to what alienates persons from ecological settings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christopher. Great. And again, if anyone has a question for Christopher, please feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand. I can also ask questions for you. So to start us off, Christopher, I really loved this presentation and thought it was really interesting, especially I am Jewish. And so I think growing up in America, American Jews are often told that like Israel is your homeland and it's a holy place. And when you go there, you'll just feel it. And when you go to the Western Wall, you'll just feel this like amazing experience. And like that is home for you. And that is this holy place for you. And so there's this huge expectation, which often I think falls short because we don't have any connection to that place. Like we've never been there before. We don't know what it looks like. We don't know what it feels like. It's in the Middle East. It's like a harsh place to be. No one's speaking your language. And so I'm wondering how you would think about that process of like someone who, and I think you spoke about this a little bit of like immigration. So someone who's like really looking forward to this new place that you don't have connections to, but you have these expectations that it will be some, kind of like magical place for you.
Yeah, I think Akhtar and others are kind of pointing to this experience of self that we've often ignored, of that they call it like, talk about like the imprinting. So usually like with animals, right? And I think the classic is like the ducklings that will follow whatever other animal because it's imprinted, or the chicks have imprinted. And yeah, it's where you're born imprints onto us, regardless of what socialization and experience of other places that should be sacred and holy for our communities. But this imprinting takes place in an ecological surround. And I think it can go both ways. We can also feel resonances in places that we've never been to are very starkly different. We can find some form of resonance with. But I think what Akhtar is trying to point to is that it is an embodied experience that's really deeply connected to all the other formations of ourself that come up. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Nathan, feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I really loved the presentation. Thank you, Christopher. I grew up in the NASA area where there really wasn't all that much natural stuff happening, but there's a lot of technology happening. And so I find that I often have a lot of resonance and like the Hartman-Rosa sense of resonance with objects that are quite objectively bad for the environment, that they should be reproduced, and find myself most comfortable in Walmarts in places like that. Are you just aware, for those of us who don't have, especially for those of us for whom that's our ecological self, how do we start to love? I mean, obviously our backyards matter and those sorts of things, but like, how do we start to love richer, more healthy ecologies?
Yeah, that's a good question, a great question. And I think as most of us are probably aware, most of us live in cities now, and most of us grew up with concrete being probably the number one space in our minds and bodies. And so I think one of the ways, like that third one I mentioned, is the utensils of living, is telling a longer ecological story of some of these items in our life, telling a longer ecological story that goes back to even to what you were saying about time, of taking back these layers of time and placing ourselves and our cities in a timeline that is not so focused on the rush and the production. And second thing that points to, even with like the food and the animal relationships, I think we all still have these amazingly diverse ecological surrounds that we're a part of. No matter how strained they are there. And so just like poetry is paying attention, I think in pastoral theology, it's about paying attention. And I think that's what we're trying to push for in the ecological self, is paying attention. And a lot of what happens with ecos anxiety or even agoraphobia is we pathologize that dis-ease. And I think more is we should be paying attention to that there's an actual relationship here that we have, that we, even though we might feel like I'm an urban child, even in our urban places. I'm from Detroit originally, and they're deer moving back, and then migrated myself as an expat to Quito, Ecuador, which is also a very large city, but surrounded by a volcano that we cannot move away from. And the bears during the pandemic came back down. And so it's connecting to an older ecological story, but also just being attentive to whatever ecological realms are around us, however small. I hope that helps answer that. It's a good question, though.
Great, thank you so much. And quickly, it looks like Leslie has a question about who are some of the other people that are discussing in this space. I'm just taking up a lot of different spaces. So for eco psychoanalysis is one. Joseph Dodds is probably the biggest name there. For pastoral, psycho, and spiritual care, there are several people that are starting, but as I mentioned before, there's been a kind of an inconsistency in our conversation. Howard Kleinbell is a Christian pastoral theologian who kind of is credited sometimes with the field of ecotherapy and telling your ecological story. People have problematics with some of the stuff. Other people are like Alicia Jones and David Siegel, Canadian, who kind of upend some of the settler notions that kind of come into play with eco-anxiety and treatment, how we're still sometimes using the land as an adjunct. It's still a problematic. So those are other two people that are really, and then finally Sittler, I can't remember his first name, as another psycho-spiritual care provider that's done a lot for examining this long kind of lost aspect of how we look at people's
relationship between their inner lives and their external lives.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Christopher. For such a great presentation. We will now move on to our final presenter this afternoon.